Welcome to True Crime Paranormal with the Psychic Sisters. I'm Kristi Brower, here with my co-host, Katie Weaver.
Good morning.
Good morning. We are so excited to be here, or evening, or midday, or whatever time it is when you're listening to this.
True.
But we're really excited. This is our maiden voyage of True Crime Paranormal. I will tell you that it is not our maiden voyage as podcasters. You have probably, if you're listening today, you probably know us in some way. Maybe from Blog Talk Radio, maybe from CBS News Sky Radio, and maybe from 1-2 Radio. But they are all live streaming podcast sources, and that is where you'll probably have heard us before. But we're here with a brand new show, a brand new format, and something we are super excited about. So the way this will work, as you know, our name is True Crime Paranormal, and what that means is that we're going to cover each story in our podcast in two ways. The first is we will cover it in true crime style. We're going to tell you the story. We're going to tell you about all the players in the story. We're going to tell you about the investigation. We're going to tell you about all the theories. And then we're going to take a little break and move into what we call the psychic analysis. So these stories, every story that we tell on this podcast will be a story that has a paranormal bent, a paranormal element, a paranormal theory, but it will also be a true crime theory of some sort. So we want to mix it up. We both are true crime junkies. We are also paranormal junkies. Katie and I both have worked for many years as professional psychics and done lots of work in the world of paranormal stuff, paranormal phenomenon. And so we decided to take all of that and roll it into one podcast. So that's what we're so excited about sharing with you today. So
True.
I think, Katie, we ought to get going with our very first story.
I think so too. This is really fun. It's so exciting. And it's really fun it's different for us because, I was thinking about where we've always done live radio. Being evergreen, that people are going to listen whenever they're going to listen. And it's just, this is all a little different. It's really fun. I have loved the creative angle so far of this endeavor with both of us, all of the research.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, yeah. I'm having a hard time doing anything else, to be honest.
I had to climb out of my rabbit hole this morning to get ready to even record the podcast because I was watching a documentary on this story up to like 20 minutes ago.
Yeah.
For real. This has been wild.
So wild. Yeah, it's so awesome. I love the research. It reminds me how much of a journalist I am at heart, and how much I love the research angle and looking at all of the different pieces. So It's going to be great. So today, of course, we're talking about the Dyatlov Pass incident.
Of course we are. If you haven't heard about the Dyatlov Pass incident, you've probably been living under a rock or possibly in a cave with a mink. I'm just kidding. But
probably with a mink.
Possible because
that's what I'm getting.
This is a super, super famous story, particularly in Russia. They call it the JFK of Russia because this is the most famous unsolved conspiracy kind of story, mythological story, even in some ways, in Russian culture. So this happened in 1959. So on January 23rd-ish of 1959, the dates are all a little dicey. This was a long time ago. But roughly January 23rd, 1959, a group of originally 10 cross-country skiers from Ural Polytechnic Institute set off on a trek. Now, this was quite a trip. It was throughout in the wilds of Siberia in the winter. It was a cross-country ski trip that was 200 miles, and it was supposed to be completed in 16 days. Now, this was a dangerous trip, and it was a trip that some people thought they should not undertake. Igor Dyatlov was the leader of this expedition, and he was a very experienced cross-country skier and had done tons of backcountry cross-country skiing. And to him, he was like, we're fine. We're going to be fine. This is just going to be great. So they cross 190 miles of their trip is across the North Ural Mountains. This is in Western Russia. It is Siberia. And it is almost completely uninhabited. And we'll talk about who does inhabit this place, but it is mostly uninhabited. So what they were going to do is they were going to travel to a point where there was a town. They were going to send a telegram that said, hey, we made it. And then they were going to turn around and go back the way that they had been. So they were, going to let somebody know halfway through that they were okay. So I'm going to tell you the sort of generally accepted version of this story first.
Yeah.
And then we will get into some of the other facets of this, because you have to remember, this is Russia in 1959. Okay. This is KGB era. This is everything is classified. This is the Russian government lies about everything kind of era. Like this is it's a scary time, and it's a time in which it's very difficult to know exactly what's true. But I will tell you the roughly publicly accepted story, and then we'll get into some of the other things. So their last night of their trek was February 1st or 2nd. And they made camp at the foot of what I will call the Mountain of the Dead. I'm not going to attempt all the Russian because I know I'll get it wrong. My Idaho vernacular not working today, and I don't want to disrespectfully mispronounce everything. So the thing is, when they made camp at the foot of the Mountain of the Dead, is that this isn't where they were supposed to be. They had kind of lost their way due to blizzarding conditions, of course, and they were about 6 miles off course. Now, that night, the temperature was somewhere between minus 30 and minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That is below zero, guys. Now, Katie and I are from Idaho. We are very familiar with below zero weather. We know how unbelievably dangerous it is to go out in minus 30, minus 40 below weather. Like, I cannot imagine being on a cross-country ski trip, staying in a tent in that kind of cold.
No, I mean, when you walk outside in 30 below weather, and we've both done it, instantly your lungs feel a little frozen, your snot freezes in your nose,
your breath,
eyes freeze, your breath freezes. Like, that is unbelievably cold.
It's
my
so
question
dangerous.
with that too, and I don't know if you know, but is that including wind chill or not including wind chill? Do you know?
I believe it is including wind chill. As I understand it, it's including wind chill, because if it wasn't, it could have been easily 20 or 30 degrees below zero, even more with wind chill.
Because when it's that cold, even a tiny breeze can drop the temperature another 10, 20 degrees. So
as we know, I mean, we've been in sub-zero weather recently, and it might be 1 or 2 degrees above zero, and with wind chill, it's 10 or 12 degrees below zero, and that's just with a light breeze. So I do believe that this was with wind chill, although there are a lot of conflicting stories around it exactly. But what we know is it was damn cold, dangerously cold at this time.
Yeah. So kind of cold that schools would be canceled, where you live, if that happened, schools would be canceled, workplaces would be canceled. Like, this is the kind of weather that people would be urged to stay home in.
Yeah. Locked down. Vehicles don't start. You will freeze. You will get frostbite within just minutes of being outside. Injury from the cold is very, very dangerous and happens very quickly at this temperature. So we know that. Yeah. So, at this time, something happens. Now, we're going to get into a lot of different theories about what happens, but ultimately what happens is that all 9 of the people that are still on the expedition at this point, and we're going to tell the story of the 10th who isn't with them at the time later, but all 9 of the individuals on this expedition die. They all die. And they do not make it to their checkpoint. They're supposed to make it to their checkpoint by the 20th of February. They don't get there. Maybe it's the 15th of February, 15th to the 20th, somewhere in there. They were supposed to send that telegram. Well, they don't. So somebody sounds the alarm, and they send out a search party looking for them. It takes them a week to find their camp, to find them at all. So they're out in this way super remote area. It is, so it is literally 3 weeks since they have died before they're found. So one of the problems with knowing exactly what happened to them is that 3 weeks of Siberian weather occurred between the time that they died and the time that they were found. And I think that that's a huge factor in having a difficult time knowing exactly what happened. So about a week after they set off, the search party finds the tent that they had set up at the foot of the Mountain of the Dead. The tent is abandoned, and in the pictures that I've seen, it's got quite a bit of snow on it, and it's partially collapsed. And they start, one of the things that they find very interestingly, they kind of uncover the tent, they look inside, and all of their snow clothes are in there. Their boots, their coats, all the stuff that you would most definitely be wearing if you were outside in minus 40-degree temperatures are inside the tent. The other thing that they find that is really weird is that there are slits cut in the tent. The tent is literally cut open, like with a knife. Later, they will determine forensically, okay, this is 1959. I don't know how much forensically really they had, but what they say they determine is that the tent was cut open from the inside, which is a very strange thing. If you're in minus 40-degree weather, you know that the only thing keeping you alive is the body heat of all the people with you inside that tent. You would not cut a hole in it. It would kill you, for real. So what appears to have happened is that they left the tent in a huge hurry, leaving behind even their boots. They were all either barefoot or wearing socks. And some were wearing like one shoe. Like they were just trying to throw on whatever they could in a hurry, and they were out of that tent. Now, this is unbelievable to me, thinking about what would make me leave a tent in minus 40-degree weather at night in Siberia. And I can't think of a damn thing that would make me go out into that. Can you?
Right. Well, I can't think of what would make me go in the first place, but
well, me either. But I'm definitely not a hardcore backcountry cross-country skier, and we know people who are. Lots of people where we live are, but I wouldn't do it.
But essentially, you would have to know that if you were leaving that tent and heading out into that, you were going to die.
You're going to die. Yeah.
I mean, you would have to know, at least some part of you, even if you were in some state of terror. That was the last ditch effort. I mean, that's to me.
Exactly. It was just panic. It was not rational thinking, because if you're going to die in the tent, you're also going to die outside the tent. That's just the reality of it. So they find the first of the bodies, 2 of them, and they are a mile from the camp. This is the other part that is amazing to me. In that cold, with no shoes on, these men they found were wearing long underwear, and that was it. Yeah. How did they make it a mile? How did they live a mile in 40 below? I don't know. They were on the ground surrounding what appeared to be maybe a small fire that they had tried to build. Some people said their hands were actually burned, like they had tried to literally put their hands in the flames. They were that cold. There was also some evidence that they had tried to climb a tree right there. Yeah. Like they were trying to get up high and see something. And they died of hypothermia right there around the fire.
And they both had very significant physical injuries too.
Yeah, like they'd been in a fight. Like they'd been in some kind of a fist fight. Their hands were all dinged up, and they looked like they'd been in a fight.
And blunt force trauma.
Yeah.
Blunt force trauma to the chest and head.
Here's the hard thing about the blunt force trauma and all the trauma is that there are so many conflicting stories about the damage to the bodies. Some people say only 3 of them had blunt force trauma. Some say they all did. There were autopsies done. That stuff has all been kept as classified information. Yeah. Now, I will get to some of that because I watched a documentary that was done in 2014 where they did get to see some of the classified information, and we'll get to that a little more. But they were injured. They were not in a good place. Not only were they frozen to death, but they were injured. Yeah. So a little ways from them, they also found 3 more bodies. Yeah. They appeared to be running back toward camp when they died. They also froze to death. There's question about if they were physically damaged as well. Some of what I've read said is that some of them had broken ribs, skull fractures, and then also that they had like internal organ damage. We're going to get to, I've done some research about what could potentially cause things like that so that we can, look at this from kind of the rational side of it. And then we're going to tune into it and tell you what we get. Let's see. So the last 4 were not found until 2 months later. And they were about 75 meters away from the pine tree where the first 2 were found in a ravine. And they were covered in about 4 feet of snow by this point. Those 4, they were actually dressed for the weather. They weren't in their underwear. They were dressed in warmer clothes. They were also wearing some of the clothes of some of the other people, which they thought was weird. And maybe it was just rushing, throwing stuff on as fast as possible. You weren't paying attention to if it was yours or not. There was also a question about whether some of the other, if they died a little later and some of the other victims had some clothes on that they pulled off of them and put on themselves. There's a lot of question about why they weren't all wearing their own clothes. Now, these 4 are the ones that definitely had experienced severe blunt force trauma, broken ribs. 1 victim had a skull fracture. 2 of these victims also had radioactive material on their clothing. Okay, that was super weird. And we'll get to why that is especially weird. Now, one of the victims, a woman, she was missing her tongue, her eyes, and a bunch of her facial tissue. Like something had chewed her up. She was missing like predation kinds of injuries.
Yeah.
She was the only one that had injuries like that, though, which they thought was very strange. So the official Russian investigation into their deaths took 4 weeks. And after 4 weeks, they determined that they died from an elemental force that the tourists were not able to overcome. Vague much?
Yeah.
Okay, so and we're going to get to the theories here in a minute, but that's what they determined. And then they closed the investigation and they classified all of the files around these deaths.
Yeah.
And they stayed classified for 50 odd years, which, you got to remember who this was and where this was at the time that it was. 1959 in Russia. For one, it was a time when anything that could have appeared to look bad on the part of the Russian government would never have been released.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Totally.
Ever. And there would have been lots of spin and there would have been lots of, ways to try and save face. And there were a lot of things.
Complete control of the media.
Yeah, total control of the media.
Completely control the narrative. Yeah.
Total control of all of the information that went around. Okay, so let's talk about some of the theories around this story. So, one of the reasons that this became so famous is because these were young, in their 20s or early 30s students. They had lives ahead of them, had families. This was so many people were impacted by this, and particularly a man named Yuri Yutin. Yuri Yutin was the 10th man on this expedition. Now, this is where I think we get into sort of our realm of things a little bit, because he was on the expedition only for a couple of days and then started feeling sick. But you know what he felt? He felt heart palpitations. Do you know what I feel when I'm having a really strong intuitive hit to get the hell out of a situation?
Right.
Heart palpitations. It's anxiety symptoms, right?
Yeah.
So he says he's sick. He can't do this. He turns around and he goes back.
Yeah.
And so he's the only survivor. And we'll get to how he kind of came into play in the investigation here in a little bit, because he was interviewed in this documentary that I watched, and we'll talk about that. So some of the things, people really wanted to say this was just a natural phenomenon, right? We talked about it was probably an avalanche. Well, there was no avalanche in the area.
There was no avalanche, no.
And there's never been an avalanche in Dyatlov Pass. Never a recorded avalanche there. It's just not an avalanche place. Some people said a hurricane. Now, this really puzzled me because I'm like, this is inland Siberia. That's not where hurricanes happen. Well, it turns out that hurricane is just a term used in Russia to describe extreme weather. So just an extreme weather event is actually what it means when they say a hurricane, not a
Mhm.
literal hurricane. We're thinking of East Coast hurricanes here in the US. No, they're just
Right.
thinking of an extreme weather event. And of course,
Right.
in Siberia, there are a lot of extreme weather events. Let me tell you about one. So there is a scientific some people in the scientific community, the weather community particularly, have an idea around this, and it's called the Kármán vortex street. And it is a group of whirlwinds that produce a low frequency sound. And so you don't actually hear it, but it vibrates the hairs in your ears, and it causes nausea and intense psychological discomfort. It can cause confusion and fear and panic. And so some people think that a weather event like that happened and that's what caused them to cut open their tent and run out because something was happening, but they didn't know what. I don't know. These are experienced expeditioners, they're experienced in cross country skiing in this kind of weather. Would they really leave their tent in a situation like that? And if they did, why were they so beat up? Where does the blunt force trauma come in? Those whirlwinds don't cause blunt force trauma. Why do they look like they've been in a fight? Why are their knuckles all beat up like they look like they've been fighting something? That one didn't fly for me so much, but I thought it was interesting that, we're talking about a place that can have some really weird weather.
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm going to get to a few of these, and then I'm going to get to the big one that, kind of the big one.
So there's lots of big ones.
There's so many. Okay.
Mhm.
We can't possibly cover all of them because this show would be
No.
like 10 hours long. And you probably would get bored. But, of course, the idea of aliens, some kind of alien event came up. There
Oh,
were
yeah.
orange lights in the sky documented by people 50 miles away from where they were at the time that
Mhm.
this occurred. And so there was a question about, were there UFOs in the sky that night? Could something have happened? Because here's one problem. They don't find a lot of footprints around the bodies except for the footprints made by the people. So there's not a lot of evidence that anyone else was around them at the time. However, we are talking about 3 weeks after the event.
Yeah.
It snowed. How do you know for sure that there aren't?
Well, and the
I have
winds have
questions about that.
blown like crazy, and
Yeah, we know
you
how
know
wind will travel, how snow travels.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know. There's questions about that. Okay. So then there's a question about, was there some kind of a nuclear event, because they aren't very far at this point from a Russian nuclear test site. And if there's anything we know about Russians and nuclear test sites or nuclear anything,
Yeah.
they lie. Okay, we know that.
Mhm.
All you have to do is know the story of Chernobyl to know that if this was a nuclear event, we would never know the truth.
Yeah.
So there's a question about that. But I wanted to know, would their injuries stack up with a nuclear event? So I did some research on blast injuries. So what kind of injuries do you get from a blast? And there are several different kinds. So primary blast injuries are like internal body organ damage, lung damage, stomach, brain, rupture your eardrums, rupture your eyes, that kind of
Mhm.
thing. Gas-filled parts of your body will be injured first.
Mhm.
So secondary blast injuries come from debris. If there's something, a building falls down on you, or,
Sure.
something's flying around. Well, they're out in Siberia in the snow. The only thing that could be hitting them is trees. There was
Mhm.
no evidence in the photos that I saw that indicated that there was tree damage. So I
No.
don't know about that. So then there are tertiary blast injuries. Tertiary blast injuries are the injuries that people get when they are thrown through the air into something else. And that is when blunt force trauma happens. A couple of them were found by a tree. The tree had some
Mhm.
damage. They took that to be damage from climbing the tree. But they weren't all found by a tree. They weren't
No.
all found. And this is out in deep snow. So really, were there very many things for them to be blown into? Was there evidence of a blast pattern in the snow? No, there really wasn't. So although I will admit, I wanted this to be a nuclear thing really bad.
Mhm.
That was my initial thought, is this is nuclear. The government has done something nuclear and they've covered it up, because there was nuclear
Mhm.
material on two of their on two
Mhm.
people's clothing. Well, it is near a nuclear blast site. Those two people that were down in the ravine, there is a stream that runs through the bottom of that ravine. And that stream has been known to be contaminated with radiation because of the nuclear testing going on nearby. And so they think that that could have happened. They were kind of laying in the stream. The one woman particularly that had parts of her face missing was laying face down in the stream. So, could that have answered why nuclear, material was on their clothing? It could generally. And I would think if this was a nuclear blast, they would all have radioactive material on them, and they didn't. Only 2 of them did. Although interesting that they thought to test them for it, don't you think?
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that every time do they test every single body for radiation when they do an autopsy? I kind of doubt it.
I kind of doubt it too. That seems like a stretch, right?
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah. It seems like something maybe they knew that we don't know, because I'll tell you one thing I know from studying this case, there's a lot of stuff we don't know.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to get into probably the most popular theory. Well, first I'm going to tell you what the Russian government thought happened initially, and then I'm going to tell you. So initially, they blamed the Manzai tribe. And the Manzais are an indigenous tribe that live in the Ural Mountains, which is where these skiers were. Yeah. They're very isolated. The reason they suspected them is because in the 1930s, a Manzai shaman murdered a scientist that was out studying. I think he was a geologist, and he was out studying the rocks in the area. Yeah. So they don't like, visitors. They don't like trespassers. No. They the trees around where they live are marked with these symbols so that people know that they're walking into Manzai territory. And they do a lot of things to warn people off. But this initially brought suspicion on them. The other reason there was suspicion on them is because the skiers kept a journal of every day of their experiences and what was happening. And the skiers document in their journal a confrontation with some people from the Manzai tribe when they entered their territory. And in there were a lot of photos. They found one of them had a camera, and there are tons of photos. They took lots of photos, and there are photos of the Manzai symbols carved into the trees. And so they thought they had this confrontation with the Manzai tribe. They went into their territory anyway, and then Manzai went and killed them. The reality is there's really no evidence that happened. There's lots of evidence to the fact that it didn't. But apparently, according to a documentary that I watched where they interviewed some people from the Manzai tribe, they said that the KGB actually took some of the Manzai tribal members and tortured them and interrogated them and accused them of these murders. They eventually cleared them because they could not find anything that indicated that they actually did it. Yeah. The Manzai tribe says that what they were actually doing is they were warning them not to go into the woods. And they were warning them not to go into the woods because of the mink. And here we have the big theory. The mink. Yep. So the mink is the Yeti, right? Now, you're going to love it when I tell you about this documentary, Katie, because there's a very famous man in Idaho in this documentary, someone that comes up in every Bigfoot or Yeti documentary, and we'll get to that in a minute. Yeah. So they talked to this woman who was 5 years old at the time that the Dyatlov Pass incident happened. And she remembers when the students came through. She remembers the confrontation, she says. She said the reason that they were warning the skiers is because at that time there were children disappearing in the woods and never coming back. Wow. They believed it was the mink. It was the Yeti that was taking these kids. They also were finding dead deer, and the deer had their tongues ripped out. Now, remember that one of the members of the Dyatlov party also had her tongue ripped out. Yeah. So there was a lot of speculation around this. So that brings me to probably the biggest theory, anyway, from a paranormal standpoint, I think, that we have of what happened here. So a lot of this information comes from the documentary called Russian Yeti, The Killer Lives, and this was done in 2014. Now, I want to give this with a caveat because this was filmed like every Bigfoot documentary I have ever seen.
Yeah.
Which is they know what they're going to find before they ever find it, and so everything is filmed in order to lead to that point. It's not objective at all. It also has it has tons of reenactments of things that we have no idea if they actually happened or not. And so it really crosses the line between fantasy and reality. It's a Discovery Channel documentary, and you know how Discovery Channel
like the mermaids. Yeah. Okay.
Do y'all remember the mermaid documentary that absolutely ruined Katie's daughter's life?
It ruined my life, people.
Yeah,
because that kid didn't sleep for 3 months. She would come in my room nearly every night crying because she was really afraid of mermaids. Now, know this. We live in Idaho. We're landlocked. At that time, she'd never even been to the ocean. But mermaids were going to get us for sure. Thanks, Discovery Channel. Yep.
Right. Well, and it was filmed in a very similar way, where so much of it was fabricated and it was so directed, and the people that they spoke to coached, you know. So the reason I bring it up, one, is because this is a very prevailing theory. Also because if they are to be believed, they got access to a bunch of documentation from the Russian government that we'd never seen before. And so there's some information in that documentary that they swear that, so they worked with a Russian journalist who helped them get a lot of these interviews and get a lot of this information. And if the things that they found are true, then the story takes a kind of a turn, to be perfectly honest. So they tell the basic story of, you know, the Dyatlov incident.
Yeah.
I can't remember what it's called. Incident. Yeah. So they tell the story with a few caveats. They go talk to the Manzai tribe. And the Manzai tribe is who tells them, hey, what we were really doing was warning them off from the mink. And that the mink was, you know, in the woods, and we were afraid that they were, you know, it would kill them because it had been killing other people.
Yeah.
And the kids kind of just blew it off. You know, there's one thing that's very interesting. So they were writing a little newspaper. They were doing a lot of documenting of this, you know, in photos, in diaries. They were writing a little newspaper about their trip. And in one point in the newspaper, there's a headline that says, "We now know the snowmen exist." There's a lot of different theories about what they meant by that. Some people think they just meant it was them in the Ural Mountains. The snowman exists in the Ural Mountains. Well, here they are, you know.
Yeah.
Or was it, in fact, that the Manzai had told them about the mink, and sometimes the mink was called the snowman, and so they were talking about that? Or had they, in fact, seen it? So they got a hold of, in this documentary, they got a hold of the photos that, not only the photos, but also the negatives of the photos, which I thought was interesting because the negatives tell you a lot because they're all together in one piece. They're not separated or cut apart. And so it is intentional to show you that it was all the same roll of film. Where the day before they were killed, this documentary absolutely swears up and down that they took a picture of a mink. And it's one of those black and white, vague, kind of looks like an animal or a very large man hunched over in the woods picture that we've seen on how many Bigfoot documentaries. I mean, it's a very typical, was that just a guy in shadow, or was that really,
or was it a tree, a weird tree in a shadow?
It's pretty clear. Some of them definitely, I think, do are trees, but this photo looks a lot more like an animal. It really does. So they go from that standpoint, and they go way off the rails in this documentary. And I'm not going to tell you all of it because most of it is they go out to prove that the mink exists and a bunch of stuff. And that's not really germane to our investigation here. But one of the things that they do is that they go to the Dyatlov Institute. The Dyatlov Institute was formed to preserve the story and the evidence and the witness, like the rescuer people's testimonies, those kinds of things. And there they meet two of the rescue team. So there are two guys who were literally there, part of the team that went and found them in the first place. And they say that the tent had small slits in the top of it and big slices on the sides. They think that they were cutting holes in the tent to see what was outside. Again, it's minus 40. It's dark. It's winter.
Mhm.
That would kill them. Why would
That's
they
death.
do that?
Yeah.
I don't know, but they did verify that they did physically see those things. Then they also say that they saw large, deep footprints leading from the tent. And that had not ever been reported in anything I've read. Everything I've read has said the only footprints that were found were the footprints of the victims themselves. They swear that there were footprints in the snow that were large, like, your typical Bigfoot footprint we've all seen, the casts they take and stuff. It was like that. They also referenced that the autopsies of the victims, the doctor that performed the autopsies said that the blunt force trauma that the victims experienced could not have been caused by a human. Like, you can't punch somebody in the head hard enough to cause the kind of blunt force trauma that they had. That it had to come from something stronger than them. So, of course, that leads again to the Mank. And here then comes our Idaho famous Jeff Meldrum. So Jeff Meldrum is a scientist at Idaho State University, where Katie and I went to college.
Yeah.
And he is a legit, for real Bigfoot researcher. He's a biologist. He's in every Bigfoot documentary you ever see. There's always some quote from Jeff Meldrum. He is very well respected because he doesn't take this from a paranormal side of things so much as he truly believes that there is a primate of some sort that exists across the world that we have yet to discover. And he compiles all kinds of evidence. He showed a big footprint that came from Russia of what the Manx footprint looks like, and all that kind of stuff, which was interesting. So then they discover something else that I had not heard anywhere else either. And that is that the Soviet government had something called the Snowman Commission. And it was actually an expedition to prove that the Mank exists. And they were investigating in the Ural Mountains in January of 1959. Now that is, and they had the documentation of it. Of course, I haven't physically seen it. I just seen it, I just saw it on the film. So, but they swear, first of all, they used that word, snowman. And so did the people in the expedition, which I thought was very interesting. Also, lots of the Dyatlov files are still classified. They got access to some of them. They got the photos. They got some of the journals. They didn't get it all. And why is it classified? Like, if this really was just an extreme weather event that killed tourists, as they said, why would you classify the story? Like, that doesn't really make sense, does it?
No.
Okay. So this is where it gets weird. So remember Yuri Utin?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So he's the guy that left the expedition early.
Right.
Now, some stories say that he left the expedition before it started. These guys say he left it a couple of days in. He seemed to confirm that that was the case.
Yeah.
Okay, so he records a video on his deathbed talking about his experiences with this. And here's what happened. So he was asked to identify the hikers' belongings. So he was asked to go through all their stuff, identify it was theirs, let them know if there was anything in their stuff that didn't belong to them as they were doing this investigation, right? So you know what he finds in their belongings? Is a military boot cover. It's the kind of boot covers that the Russian military wore over their boots. They showed it. It's army green. It's stamped with Russian lettering. And he said that no one had anything like that no one had any reason to have that with them. And so that was very strange. Indicated that maybe the Russian government maybe had actually been to this site before the searchers had been to the site. So they get access to some military files. The journalist gets some access to the military files. And one of the things that they find very interesting, the file was stamped that it was opened on February 6th. Well, they didn't find this, supposedly didn't find these hikers, these skiers, until the 20th of February.
Right.
So the military has this file opened on February 6th, and there are photos of the tent. There are photos of the bodies. There are also some photos that look like Bigfoot footprints. They're in the snow. I know how variable snow is. It's hard to determine if it really is that or not. Of course, the guys in the documentary wanted it to be that. But,
of course,
there is some indication here that the military knew about these missing skiers long before anyone else did. Because the reason they didn't find them until, late in February is because they didn't turn up. They weren't late to their halfway point until the 15th or the 16th or something like that.
Right.
So this was long before that. So it is believed that somehow the Russian military did know about this, that had already been out there. And then they just left it to be found.
Right.
Which is another secretive, why are you hiding this kind of thing? If you found them, why don't you just say you have found them? Why did they then let these people go searching for them? Which was really interesting. So this is when they talk about that they found a piece of paper in the tent that says something about, now we know the snowman exists. So in some stories, this was the headline of an article in the newspaper that they were writing. Some people say it was written by itself on a single piece of paper in the tent alone. If they're being attacked by a mink, I'm not sure that somebody is going to take a moment to jot down, now we know the snowman exists, before they go burning out of their tent in their underwear in 40 below weather. I don't know.
Right. Or did they start writing that after they had talked to the Mansai?
Right.
And that was the basis of writing that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's hard to know, but that definitely, there's a lot of question around that. So this is when they find the last of the photos, and they find this dark figure in the forest that is supposedly a mink, and it is in the original negatives. They showed the negatives. They're all in a row. They're not cut apart or anything. They're all together. You know how, if you're too young listening to this, you don't even know what we're talking about. But you know how photos you used to get, you'd get your photos developed, and when you got them back, you would get the negatives, and the negatives are basically the strip of film that can be used to recreate the pictures over and over again, right?
Sure.
So those were with the pictures. It seemed to all be intact, not separated. It also seemed to flow with the other stuff. They were taking a lot of pictures just out into the forest. And we've done this, right?
Yeah.
You think you see something, you take a picture, and then you just get a picture that's just trees. There were a lot of those pictures leading up to this picture of the mink. So maybe. So one big question that comes up is, why did the mink attack them? Because they said that they talked to some Yeti researchers who said that there are 5,000 accounts of contact with a mink in that area. And none of them indicate that the mink tried to attack them unless the mink was threatened. So there were some with hunters that got charged because they had guns or whatever. But most of the time, minks, the Yeti doesn't. It just tries to get away because it wants to be elusive. It doesn't like being seen, right? So why would a mink attack this tent full of kids? Well, so then they show this very sketchy, dark video of a guy who says, I think he says he was Russian military, but how do you know? And that what had been happening is that there was a 2-stage rocket test that night from that nuclear test site. And that 2-stage rocket crash landed not very far from where these kids were camped.
Okay, and that makes so much sense.
Right.
It'll make sense in a minute. Yeah.
Yeah. The orange light in the sky. They think that provoked the mink to attack the tent. And the kids were freaking out. They didn't know what was attacking them. They cut the holes in the tent to see what was attacking them. And then they just went out on the dead run in their underwear because they thought something was trying to kill them. And then they died of exposure. In the midst of that, some of them came into physical contact with the mink and were injured. And that's where their injuries came from.
Okay.
It wraps it up pretty nicely, honestly. I don't know if it's too convenient. But it does kind of make sense. Like, there are a lot of separate pieces of this that don't make sense, and this brings them together in a way that kind of does make sense, if in fact the Menk exists. Now, there are stories of Yetis across the globe, right? We live in a mountainous, remote place. There are tons of stories of Yetis here, but they're everywhere. That's a remote, backcountry, mountains, woods kind of place has a story about a Yeti or a Bigfoot or whatever you want to call it, or a Mank. And so I don't like the way that these stories are covered, because they're always covered in a way that's very, sensational. But do
Yeah.
I legitimately think that something like that exists? I do. You look at Jeff Meldrum's research; it's legitimate. There's real stuff there.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if that's what killed these kids or not, but it does make some sense to me. I don't know, Katie. Does that theory ring true to you?
Mostly it does. And the reason why is because, and we'll get to this here in the psychic analysis, but I had, I've studied this case more than once, and every time I've looked at it, I have really believed that there was that, that they were attacked by these beings. But I channeled a message this morning from one of the hikers, and so what I'm hearing from you is really, really making sense. In some ways, and in other ways, she's going to counter that a little bit in the message that I channeled from her. But so yes and no. How's that?
Okay. That for me as well. I mean, I think that there's a lot we don't know. I think there are pieces to this puzzle that, if we had them, would make this all fit together better. But it does bring together a bunch of the elements that seem unrelated to make it related. Obviously, I mean, Sasquatch is still considered to be a kind of a paranormal kind of a thing, because we don't literally truly have proof that it exists. But I feel a little more settled about the story with this outcome than I did with some of the others that I've read, because it doesn't leave out so many pieces of the puzzle like a lot of the other answers do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Agreed.
Well, why don't we? Now, that's the story.
That's the story.
And if you want to look up the Dyatlov Pass incident, and you want to spend the next, 5 years researching it, feel free. There's books, there's documentaries, there's websites, there's a zillion articles. It will take forever.
Yeah.
We've covered it as comprehensively as I feel like we could. But certainly do your own research on it too. There's so much out there.
Oh, yeah.
But I think now let's move into the last segment of our show, which is the psychic analysis. So we want to take a moment as professional psychics, as people who've worked in paranormal things for many, many years, and really ask, what intuitively do we feel happened? So, Katie, I know that you have a channeled message for us. So do you want to start with that?
I do. So this morning, I was just taking my coffee and thinking about this case, and and about how all the weird pieces, and that obviously all the misinformation. And, as a professional psychic medium, I will be honest, I don't always really remember to use my gifts the way I could, right? And suddenly I felt like, why don't I try to channel one of the hikers? Like, they could tell us what happened, at least to some degree, right?
Right.
And actually, one of the girls came through really strong for me. She called herself Ludi, though it looks like they called her Luda, but potatoes,
Right.
potatoes, right? But she called herself.
Could have been a nickname. That's very close.
So she told me quite a few interesting things. I'm not going to read her message exactly because it's a little disconjointed, but I'm going to put it together. So a few things. On Yuri, the Yuri that turned back after 2 days.
Yeah.
Yuri she said his discomfort came because 2 of the other men that were on this hike, after they got into it, after they started on the hike, they were immediately talking about the snowman. She says they called him the snowman because that's what the loose translation of what the Mansi called it.
Mm-hmm.
Called the mink was the snowman, or at least that's how they were translating it.
Gotcha.
She said they were already talking about that. They had already discussed going off course. She said they weren't off course because of weather. They weren't lost. They knew exactly where they were going.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
That is interesting.
But these were plans that were kind of dropped on the group by two of the men. I'm thinking Dyatlov was probably one of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or not Dyatlov, but Yuri, not Dyatlov, the other Yuri that was in charge of this group. Anyway.
Yes. He was Dyatlov. Yeah,
he was Dyatlov. Okay, sorry. Anyway, so she says that after, once they got on the trek, these two men were really excited. She said it kind of was fishy, but they were very excited. They had been talking to people. They had some research. I feel like they knew. She said they knew more than they were saying. And what I suspect is true is that they knew about the government group already. I'm not convinced they weren't actually a part of it or were, maybe sharing notes. There was some connection to the government group that was looking for the snowman, or that had.
That is super
There was the connection there. So anyway, but the Yuri that left the group was pissed and wasn't having it. The other hikers, she said, they were all really adventurous. They were all super, chill to just go. It was exciting. It was kind of a big deal to be able to be a part of this group.
Mm-hmm.
There had been some press about them. They didn't want to turn back, but he did. He was not having it. And so basically, I would say that the heart palpitations that he said he was having, he probably was, because he got really freaked out about it and upset and left the group. So she said that that's why he left. Now, as they got closer to where they were going, so again, they were not off course. She says they knew right where they were going.
I find that really interesting because they were so experienced. I found it strange that they would be able to get off course, because I'm sure that they were using navigational skills and the sun and the North Star and compasses and stuff to make sure that they knew where they were. And so I thought that was odd, considering their experience, that they would get off course.
Well, and I asked her why. I said, well, what was it about where you were going? Right. And all she said was, because that's where Yuri said we needed to go. So, Yuri had a plan. He knew. He had
some kind of inside knowledge.
He did. Yeah. And she said that, again, they weren't really privy to everything that he and one of the other men seemed to know, but it was kind of, she called it a lark. This was a big fun thing they were doing that they would be able to talk about forever. And she thought would bring them some fame. And so that's kind of what they were doing.
Interesting. Well, it did seem like they were documenting it very well. Like they thought that they would need that information at some point.
Definitely.
Because they were doing something that I read in one place that no one had ever done this, had never trekked all the way across this part of the Ural Mountains before. And that some people didn't want them to go because it was so dangerous and they didn't know what they were going to encounter.
So but she said it was really an honor to be a part of this group, to be considered a skilled enough hiker to be able to be a part of this group.
Sure.
Especially as a woman, to be, allowed to be involved was a big deal for her and the other woman that went.
Yeah. And I thought that too, that I thought it was interesting that there were two women on this trip in Russia in 1959. It just didn't seem like a time when women necessarily would have been involved.
Yeah. So then about their confrontation with the Mansi, she says that Yuri was very rude to them, acted as if he was, that they didn't see them as equal. She said it was actually a very racist time that we don't, she said, you need to understand that it was a very racist time. And that, the men particularly, even though there were women in this group that were, they were strong women of their own accord, she said they didn't really have much of a say or a voice. So like they didn't speak to the Mansi, right? That wasn't their role. But she said that they were very rude to them, kind of laughed them off to their faces, but actually then later were really, really excited about it because it was confirming what they thought they were coming to see, essentially. So this they were taking the entire trek, or we're planning on it. But she says from the get-go, really, the plan was to encounter the mink. That really was what they were doing. In a sense, though, not all of that had really been conveyed to the whole group. So, take that with a bit of a grain of salt.
Mm-hmm.
So then I asked her about the night in question.
Yeah.
And here's some interesting things from her. She said, first off, what they heard was an unbelievable sound. A sound. She said they were getting ready for bed, and some people were actually in bed,
Mm-hmm.
and that they heard an unbelievable sound that kind of sounded like screeching or screaming, squealing. She said it's hard to understand. It's hard to explain it, but it was an enormous, deafening sound.
So maybe that rocket
first.
crashing.
Yes, and she said they saw green lights. I wondered if that was the light filtering through their tent, or
Maybe.
if from a ways away it was a different color than it was up close. But she said that what they saw was green light, and that it filled the entire sky, and it was absolutely terrifying. So that happened, and then she said it was dead silent for a short time. So I asked her what a short time meant. I didn't feel like I had a great answer from her, or a clear answer from her on that. A short time indicated to me that maybe it was just a minute or two. And then she said an enormous commotion surrounding their tent. She says they did not cut their tent open. She says, we did not. Because I asked her, I said, why would that happen? And she said, that did not happen. Truly, they were gathering, grabbing whatever clothes, anything they could, because they knew, they were being attacked. She also talked about a horrific smell, and that they smelled something first, and then, so basically there was almost like a fight happening outside of their tent, but was crashing into their tent, which made me wonder if there were two mink that were potentially fighting with each other.
Maybe. They did talk about that something might have, provoked them, scared them.
Yeah. And she said what happened, the sound, the crash, the whatever that was, she didn't know what it was, but she said that was so disorienting and frightening. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so then they have this, so they start screaming in the tent, trying to grab clothes, trying to, do something. She says that the tent was torn open. They did not tear it open. That didn't happen.
It's been my suspicion all along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she said that did not happen. And that it was these enormous figures, but it wasn't one. She said that there were three. There were initially two, and then a third appeared kind of out of the woods. So they, of course, start running and screaming, out into the night, basically. She said at that point, it was run for your life. And that's all anyone could think of. And so, yes, they did grab various, whatever they could on their way out the door. But this all happened in a matter of seconds.
Right.
And so they ran out into the night. Some tried to stay together. Some did not. She was in the party that made it into the ravine. Oh. She said at some point they heard screaming. They heard like terror behind them, but just didn't stop running. And so at some point she said that they were not pursued any longer, or didn't think that they had been pursued, and basically just kept running. She said she thinks that's why they stayed alive a little bit longer than the others, because they basically just didn't stop. So their bodies stayed warmer. They kept going. Mm-hmm. So that's what she knew. She did say that for a couple of days before this incident, they had felt watched and uncomfortable. I asked her about the picture of the mink. She said that they did think that Yuri felt like he had gotten a picture. They didn't know for sure that was kind of, they didn't know. They had taken a lot of pictures, and they thought maybe
no digital cameras in those days,
right? Right, but they didn't know for sure. So that's pretty much where her story ends. I said, now your body, had all of these injuries and this damage to it. She couldn't speak to that. That obviously happened after she died. She said that she froze to death, or that's what she thinks happened. You have to know that this was an extremely disorienting experience. And so I think her, her recollections were also a little bit, skewed because of that. But she says
Sure.
she believes that she did starve to death. With that in mind, then, my sense of that would be that I still think that what happened to her face was just predation. I do.
Yeah,
I don't
I do
feel
too.
like that was actually the mink, but because once they had gotten away from the mink, it seems like they didn't really have a need to pursue.
Yeah. Yeah, because the mink weren't really, I don't know. My feeling on it is that the mink weren't really after them. It
Yeah,
scared them. They ran out of their
yeah,
tent. They happened to be there. Then there was this crazy melee around them,
yeah,
and then it was all over and everyone died.
yeah, yeah. So wrong place, wrong time. I mean, it's not
Yeah,
like they were specifically a target. They happened to be there
yeah. They just
when
happened to be in the
this
wrong
thing
place at the wrong
happened.
time.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Very interesting. Thank you for that
Mhm.
channel. That clarifies a lot of things.
Yeah, some and some not. I mean, obviously there must have been a lot of footprints. There
I
must have been a
I
lot of footprints, but
I am 100% sure there were. So,
mhm.
my sense of this, I have a very strong bullshit meter.
Yeah,
And so, parts of this story come across to me as complete fabrication many
yeah,
times. But my sense of this as a psychic is that the military had that rocket crash.
mhm,
They knew they had. They went out looking for it. They
mhm,
found this insane scene
mhm,
and they covered it up because they
mhm.
thought it was related to a test that they had done.
Yeah,
I feel like they covered up all the tracks. I feel,
mhm,
they may have known about the Mank being there. They may have not,
mhm.
but I do feel like they covered up anything that made it look like it had anything to do with the military or the government. I
Uh-huh.
feel like they just covered it up and then left them there to be found by someone else to come up with what happened. They have allowed the speculation to happen for so long.
Uh-huh.
One of the things I read is that there's so much speculation. It's kind of like the Loch Ness monster,
Yeah,
that people have their 100% sure they know the
yeah,
story, and that if they even ever came out with the full truth of this story, that most people wouldn't believe it
right.
because they're convinced that they know what the truth of it is. And I
Yeah,
think it was 100% a Russian government cover up
mhm,
based on that rocket crash, and
yep,
everything else was just crazy chance.
yep,
Excuse me. Those kids were there at that time,
absolutely.
um, that it scared the mink the way that it did,
Mhm,
whatever happened there. But I think that that's really the underlying thing here, is that this was a
mhm,
government cover up to protect them from whatever, if this rocket test was illegal, if it was
yep,
nuclear, whatever it was that they were doing, they didn't want anybody to know they were doing it.
yep. I absolutely agree with that, and I do feel like they saw the mink footprints. They knew,
Yeah.
they had to have known.
Hmm.
But again, all of the
There
misdirects,
are
all
photos
of
of
the
them in the military file. The military
yeah,
file that was open on February 6th has
yeah,
photos of big footprints in the snow.
yeah, they knew. But I do feel like maybe I I don't know. What do you do? Sweep those away? I mean, or just hope that time will I had
If
wondered
they
if they
fill
had
up with
hoped
snow.
I'd wondered if they had assumed that enough time would go by before these people would ever be found, that that kind of evidence would basically be gone anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it seems like the majority of it was gone.
Uh-huh.
And you think about, I mean, the people in the ravine were found under 4 feet of snow.
Yeah.
That's how much snow fell in the 2 months from the time this happened to the time that they were found. I mean, it
Yeah.
just, yeah. So the elements were definitely in their favor in this
Surely.
situation.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. It's a fascinating case for sure.
It is absolutely fascinating, and it is also maddening because it's one of those that, will we
Mhm.
ever really know the answer?
Yeah.
And will any of the stories on true crime paranormal, will we know the answer? I don't know, I don't know, but you can
Well, we'll know what we
certainly,
know,
we'll know
right?
what we know. And I
Yep.
always encourage people to go with your gut. What do you feel is right? And that's really
Yep.
the psychic analysis part of this, is what do you feel in your gut is true
Yep.
and right and what isn't. And that's important for us to all work on, and really trust your own intuition. Obviously, the guy who left the expedition did, and he lived.
Right.
So
Right.
tells you something.
He knew. He knew
Yeah.
that shit wasn't going down with him involved. So
No, it wasn't.
And yet, if I was invited to go on a expedition to go check out a Yeti, I mean, old and fat here, but I still might have tried.
Well, if there were snow machines involved.
Right? I mean, some of us may not have shied away from that, so
I can
it's pretty
understand it,
crazy.
my wife Rhonda is a huge Bigfoot fan. Would
Oh,
she
yeah.
take the chance to do something like this? Hell yeah, if there was a snow machine involved, yes, she definitely
Right.
would.
There definitely wouldn't have been any, cross-country skiing across a mountain pass. No.
No, 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 definitely. Well, true crime paranormal fans, we've done it. This was our very first show. This,
Yes.
format gives you a pretty good idea of what we'll be doing. We'll have a new show every week, but
Yes.
what
Should
we
we
want
talk
you
a
to
little
know
about what we're doing next week?
yeah, what is it? Let's hear it.
So next week, we are going to be discussing the death of Charles C. Morgan. He
Ooh,
died in the 70s here in the US, and it's a hell of a story. So I'm very excited to get
awesome.
into it. Yep.
I am very excited. So you heard it here first. Now, we want you to know that if you love true crime paranormal and you want more true crime paranormal content, we have a deal for you. We are on Patreon. And when you
Mhm.
go to Patreon, just search for True Crime Paranormal with the Psychic Sisters. You'll find us right there. If you become a patron of our show, you will get extra content. So there are different levels, and different levels give you different extra content. But we will be offering that to everyone who is a patron. It also just helps us keep the show going. If you
Uh-huh.
love what we do and want to support us, that is a great way to support us. So go check out True Crime Paranormal with the Psychic Sisters on Patreon.
Yes.
And we will be back next week with another true crime paranormal story. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Take care, guys.